What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This is episode 29, and this week we are covering The Andromeda Evolution by Daniel H. Wilson in the spirit of Michael Crichton as a sequel to Michael Crichton's The Andromeda Strain. Now, I reviewed this book already in a pretty in-depth review, but spoiler-free on my Goodreads account, because I do have a Goodreads now, if you want to check that out at goodreads.com/King Crusoe. What this video review is going to boil down to, at least for this video, is going to be a little bit more of a free-form, fairly summarized version of all of the points that I made on the Goodreads review. This might end up being the only time that I really do this kind of thing where I'm adapting my Goodreads review, because most of my Goodreads reviews after this one have been far less in depth. I don't know why I went so in depth with this one, but I think I had a lot to say immediately after finishing it. So even for future books that I review on video that I've already reviewed on Goodreads, they won't follow this same format, but I feel like I kind of have to follow closely to what I said in the Goodreads review, because basically everything that I felt about the book was expressed pretty clearly in that. So if you just want to read that review, you're perfectly fine to just go there and read that review, or you can continue watching this video, or you can do both if you want. Just know that this video is going to be reiterating a lot of what happened in the written review. And as a result, I guess I don't need to warn you, but I will. The structure is also going to be a little bit different. Most of my reviews follow a what are the best elements, what are the worst elements, and then I basically end the video after that. This is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to be going into several different topics. Like I said, it's kind of following a similar structure to the Goodreads review, so I'm going into it a little bit differently. But with all that being said, let's get into the actual review. First up, let's talk about the prose. Now, Michael Crichton in the original Andromeda Strain never really had the best prose in the world. It was serviceable. I thought it suited well enough for the story, and I never really noticed it. If there were any major problems with it, I didn't pick up on them. If there was anything spectacular about it, I didn't personally notice. As an inherent part of writing a sequel to the book and it being a different author, the writing is obviously going to be different. Not everybody writes in the exact same way. That's kind of a given. Now, Wilson's prose in this book isn't bad by any means, but I will say to me, it was noticeably different from Crichton's prose, pretty much right from the start. And keep in mind, this was also despite there being 3 months in between reading The Andromeda Strain and reading this one. The prose does eventually get better, but the first 50-ish pages, maybe even so many as 70 pages, they do feel rather jerky and unpolished, particularly from this prose perspective. There's a little bit of this, it's not really that much of a mess, if we're being honest, but it feels or it seems messy occasionally in the very beginning section. And this isn't necessarily a prose point, but also in these first 50 to 70 pages or so, there are bits of this section that are just really kind of boring and disinteresting, interspersed with really interesting and intriguing ideas and setups that I really enjoyed. So I think that these first 50 pages or so could have definitely been cut a little bit, or at least organized a little bit differently to make it feel a little bit less of this kind of hiccupy good versus bad, moments of boring versus really interesting. But once you do get past this initial part for 75 pages, it really improves a lot, and you're pretty much good for the rest of the book in terms of not necessarily pacing, but the way that the writing serves the story. Next up, let's talk about the general subject matter. Now, Wilson does happen to have a PhD in robotics, and he makes it very obvious in this book. It plays major influence for a particular character, and there are several major plot points kind of revolve around robotics, or at least similar subject matter. This was really cool and felt very fresh to me, and if I'm speaking plainly, this major influence isn't a bad thing. Wilson makes it obvious that he's inserting his expertise into this book in a way to push the plot forward and do interesting things with it because that's what he knows about. And I kind of appreciate that. He allows his expertise to shine here. And it's honestly probably one of the better parts of the book overall. The primary subject matter, though, in terms of the Andromeda strain and the evolution itself, the way Andromeda's role was kind of expanded and adapted, overall, I think was really neat in this story for most of the book. There are some pretty major problems I had with some of the decisions that Wilson made with Andromeda in the end of the book, the climax, the final act, I guess. But the initial ideas and concepts, the I can't speak English. The initial ideas and concepts were genuinely worthy of producing a sequel. They were an honest to God step forward from the first book. And I really appreciated that it wasn't just, well, let's just do the same book over again. This is definitely not the same thing as the predecessor. And that's really cool, even if there are issues with it. And now let's get into the actual story and plot. I'm not going to spoil anything. I'm just not going to, but I will talk about kind of my ideas and thoughts about story and plot moments. Um, this is easily one of the more mixed reception I've had on an actual story since basically anything that I've read since I started reading again in September. As I suggested in the previous section, there is some subject matter and new ideas that were really good and general plot points that had incredible potential, and most of them ultimately paid off. Even if some of them weren't amazingly, most of them at least paid off satisfactorily. The problem that I had with some of this was that the ones that didn't pay off were just so out of place in the entire story and unsatisfying that in the middle of a 4-star book, within a couple pages, I could occasionally just, you know, stop and squint at the pages and wonder what in the world happened. Just visible confusion written all over on my face. This happened probably 2 times, I would say, where I was just in the middle of enjoying a really good section, just like, man, maybe this book is worthy of 4 stars. And then a couple pages later, I would just be staring at the book like, one of Crichton's charms, at least to me, is the fact that even some of the craziest and most absurd of the fiction that he puts into the books still feel grounded and realistic enough, at least the way that he frames them, that make those ideas worthy of being written about in a science fiction book. The problem that I had with this one is that there were plenty of sections where the suspension of disbelief just wasn't really there. There were several points, I will say, where I definitely found it a little bit hard to kind of throw out my understanding of reality and be like, yeah, this could happen. Most of these problems, as most of my problems with some of the things that I've mentioned before, were in the final act of the book, but it did happen a few times. Now, like I said, I won't spoil anything, and I'm not going to spoil anything about the finale, but I will talk about how I feel about the finale because, as you can probably tell by my mentioning it a few times up to this point, the entire reason I'm really conflicted about this book is because of the finale, like all things considered. Even with some of the more boring bits in the very first act of the book and some of the other minor problems that I have throughout, this story could easily be a 4-star read for me if not for the final act. The final act ultimately brought it down to 3 stars for me. All things considered, I could pretty easily get behind most of what happened in the first 2/3 or so of the Andromeda Evolution, even despite the somewhat slow bits, as I mentioned, but this final third feels pretty disjointed. For example, just over halfway through the book is a section that was like a legit horror scene. It just out of nowhere. And that scene and everything leading up to it was amazing. That scene in particular is one of my favorites that I've read this year. It was actually really good. But things start to fall apart relatively shortly after this section. I'd probably say about 50 pages after this section. Might even be less. I don't know for sure because it's been over 2 months since I read the book. But as I've mentioned before in a couple different reviews up to this point, I think a lot of these problems do come down to the way they pay off. Brandon Sanderson has mentioned in writing uh, live signing streams, or even in some of his lectures, that a lot of what makes a book is the promises versus the payoff of those promises that the author has made. There are half a dozen or more like surprise twists throughout this book, and maybe half of those don't have sufficient telegraphing or foreshadowing comparable to even say a normal or average mystery novel. There are too many payoffs for things that weren't even promised in the first place, and some of the things that were promised didn't get good payoffs. So there was a lot of disconnect at times between setups and what ultimately came from those. Like, for reference, I think that the final act of the Andromeda Evolution has like two or three relatively major twists in it, and all of them I think all of them just felt really ham fisted, or one of them felt just so jaw droppingly stupid because of improper telegraphing. Like, if some of these things were kind of built up to better, or at all in a couple of cases, there wouldn't have been so much of a problem. But there was one particular twist that was like, where did this come from? Why didn't you lead up to this at all? Maybe if I reread it, I might see some of those things a little bit better, but I shouldn't have to reread a book to understand, just basic setup for a twist that happens in the climax that is really major to the story. Like, if a twist seems like it comes out of nowhere in an unsatisfying way that doesn't feel deserved in any way, that's a problem. And this book had a couple instances of that. When these twists and revelations land and work, they really work. But the bad ones that exist in the book make me wonder if a content editor even touched this book at all. Like, did anybody tell Daniel to kind of rein it in and set expectations for things better and take away things that didn't need to exist in this final act? Sometimes I wonder. And finally, let's just kind of get into some of my general big complaints outside of those. And I know this is seeming like a really negative review, but I'll get to that in just a little bit. The first thing, in my opinion, the book is just too long. It doesn't necessarily feel bloated per se. It's not like it really needs to be shortened or anything, but I think it pretty easily, handily could have been 50 pages shorter, maybe even more, depending on how things were cut and how things were changed and edited. And that would have been good. The Andromeda Strain, at least in my copy, was only like 220 pages. Felt pretty good. This book is like 340. At least my copy of it is like 340 pages. This should have only been like 275 pages at most. Between some of those slow bits in the beginning and twists that didn't need to exist, or certain twists that needed to be handled differently, there were a lot of pacing issues with it that are just like, why is this as long as it is and as rough as it is in a couple spots? The second thing that I'll say is that the book's resolution in the final chapter slash epilogue type of thing is way too short. Somehow Wilson spends 350 pages writing this ultra ballsy sequel just to wrap it up in 10 pages, what should have been resolved in 20 or 25. Now I know this might sound weird considering that I just said it should have been 50 pages shorter, but if you cut out the things that didn't need to be cut out and fix the things that needed to be fixed, and then actually put on a proper resolution that didn't feel stupid, this resolution did feel too short. This is something that I said about the Andromeda Strain. I think that the last chapter was a bit too short. But even in the Andromeda Strain, it was just like, okay, well, I think that could have been longer, but whatever. This one is like, no. There is something that happens in the last couple chapters of this book that is just like, no, that needs to be explained better. That does not just happen this way? And then the third thing is actually what I've just been talking about here, the events of the final chapter. Remember what I said about suspension of disbelief? Yeah, this chapter can burn in a dumpster fire for all I care because it just felt so absolutely undeserved and it needed to be changed in a pretty big way. I don't need to bash this thing anymore though, so I'm going to stop there and kind of get into the conclusion, what I feel overall. I know coming to the end of this video, it may seem like I really disliked this book by the way that I just kind of talked about a lot of the negative stuff that I felt about it. It's sort of true, but mostly not. I still gave this thing 3 stars, and at many points, especially for those first 2/3 of the book, I was like, I think this thing is worthy of 4 stars. Pretty good. In essence, there are some fantastic ideas on display in the Andromeda Evolution, most of which I'm totally down for, totally into, no problems. But there are also several quite major mishaps along the way, many of which I've explained in pretty rich detail up to this point, somehow without spoiling it. Although most of these problems are in the finale, just the first 2/3 of this book are worthy of this book being read, in my opinion. And don't get me wrong, the finale isn't like horrible. It is a serviceable final act, but it was certainly messy. If you are a fan of the Andromeda strain, there is no necessity to read the sequel, but if you're interested in it in any way, like if you have any sort of curiosity, even like a morbid curiosity of, well, why is Holden complaining so much? Well, I still recommend giving the book a shot to see if it lands for you, or maybe if it lands better for you than it did for me. There is legitimately, as I've mentioned, some very worthy stuff in here, even if not all of it lands properly. If nothing else, I've got to give Daniel Wilson a lot of credit for the sheer amount of balls he had to write this thing in the first place. But I've been talking for quite a bit, and I don't have that much more to say about the book itself, so I'm going to really wrap it up here and just say go check out seasonalproductions.com, all that stuff that I say every video. Make sure to like and subscribe, check out all the other videos in the future. I'll see you over the next 2 weeks with 2 more Dark Tower reviews, so I hope you stick around to see those. Thank you guys for watching. I'll be back again in the next one.